are talking The Black Spider, although this is a German movie, so its actual title is as follows: Die SCHWARZE SPINNE. At least that's how I think you pronounce it. And this is directed by Markus Fischker, and it's actually based off a 19th century story. Now this is kind of a medieval horror. It's actually described as a drama on IMDb rather than a horror, but I personally would classify it as a horror, albeit it's a kind of light horror, but I'll describe a little bit more in detail in just a moment. So what's the story? Well, it focuses on this small rural kind of settlement of which there is this kind of castle which has been kind of recently built and is kind of ruled by this particular kind of lord. And, you know, he's kind of in charge of the castle, its people, and this kind of surrounding area with all these kind of villagers and stuff. And he's been working the villagers pretty hard. And one day, this lord is essentially feeling a little hot. So he commands his villagers to uproot 100 trees to kind of put along the kind of the either side of this road. On the kind of the way up to the castle, and the villagers protest, saying they can't afford to miss the harvest basically by doing this kind of extra work. And he's like, well, tough, you know, you die by the sword if you don't do it ultimately. So obviously the villagers are in a little bit of a turmoil, and it turns to Christina, who is this kind of midwife, and she is essentially one of the few unmarried women in this kind of village. And she has a little bit of a troubled past, and you know, she ultimately is the kind of somewhat of the healer, you know, but she mainly kind of deals in kind of people giving birth and things like this. And her father is the kind of the village elder, and one day this stranger appears. Now this stranger could well be the devil, and they offer this village rural kind of peasant population a deal. Ultimately, he'll kind of deal with all the kind of the trees and put them in, you know, get them all planted and everything like that. But there'll be a price. Now the villagers are kind of like, you know, sounds a little bit too sinister. But in secret, Christina agrees and actually makes this deal. And of course, the trees are then planted. But this comes at an inevitable cost. But what that cost will be, you'll have to watch the movie to find out. So let us discuss what I think works in this movie. This is a great example of a period piece done right. You know, I've reviewed a few movies that have taken place in different kind of portions of history and stuff. And I really feel like they do a good job of recreating this kind of, you know, what we know of this kind of period of time. You know, for example, all the villagers consistently just look like they're covered in kind of like dirt and grime. You know, I've seen plenty of kind of period movies where the attention to detail, they've got the right clothes, but they all seem too new. They look like costumes. Here, everyone looks dirty, grimy. Even the kind of the lords and his knights, for example, still look a little bit, you know, bedraggled, basically. So you have this great kind of like lived-in feel, and it has some truly beautiful cinematography with this kind of European medieval kind of flavour. You know, with this kind of the vistas, the kind of the countryside, and these kind of like these old castle and kind of medieval kind of style buildings, coupled with great kind of costuming. So it all looks fantastic, and it's shot extremely well as well. You know, this is one of these films where, had it been, you know, a Western, well, an English-speaking adaptation, I expect it will get a little bit more kind of, you know, plaudits really and kind of attention. But as it's German-speaking, you know, it somewhat flies under the radar, but it's very, very well made. The acting, I've always said it's a little bit harder to judge kind of like foreign language acting, because you don't quite know if the subtitles you're reading are conducive to what the actual emotive speech is. But from what I can see here, I think the acting here is all very, very good. Christina is like kind of our main character. You really do feel like she's, you know, caught between, you know, a rock and a hard place, basically, with the, you know, the decisions she has to make. And she does seem like a kind of very relatable, at least, obviously, bear in mind it's a different time period, kind of a protagonist, ultimately. The film is quite a slow burn, but I feel it has an interesting kind of story. You know, I wasn't kind of distracted. I wasn't kind of wanting to look at my phone when I was kind of watching this one. The story kind of did keep me engaged, and it is a slow burn, but I feel it layers in the kind of the supernatural elements stronger and stronger as the kind of the movie kind of plays out. Now, as to its description, as I've said, I would personally class this as a horror movie, because ultimately it's about a deal with the devil. There are supernatural elements. There are a plague of spiders is one of the things that is wreaked upon this kind of village. There's a little bit of body horror. And as we get to the last 20, 25 minutes, there is a very, very overt supernatural thing that happens. But what I think this is sometimes described as a drama is it doesn't play like a horror. It plays like a drama. So there's no like building up spooky atmosphere. There's no jump scares. It's not filmed in a way that is conducive of most horror films, even though I think the subject matter is definitely worthy of kind of being classified as a horror, but it's the way it's filmed is more typical of a drama. As I say, it's trying to really kind of drum up the human elements and how easily it is for people to turn on one another. And that's kind of one of the things you could say. This really has like somewhat of a metaphor for, you know, going with, I know this movie was obviously an adaptation of a 19th century novel, and apparently it's quite close. I haven't read it, but obviously from what I've read, it's apparently quite close. But you can see parallels in today's kind of like world where people go with the narrative, whatever suits them, be it, you know, on social media and the news and things like that. People are fickle, people change their minds, and people kind of go on to the next thing when it kind of suits them. And that's ultimately what happens here. Which leads me to what doesn't work. And I have to be honest with you, I thought this movie was, for the most part, very strong. Story-wise, there are just a couple of things here where I felt it was a little bit on the weaker side, in particular where the village ultimately turns on Christina. So Christina is hailed as the hero for ultimately saving the village because she made this deal. They don't really know the ins and outs of what's kind of going on, but they get an idea. And their village is saved. They planted the the trees so therefore they can get on with the harvest, etc. And she's kind of hailed as the hero, but I think they turn on her a little bit too quickly. I mean, you have to bear in mind, obviously, this is based in the 13th century. So this is obviously where, you know, folklore and superstition was at its kind of at its height. But nonetheless, I still feel it was a little bit of a quick turn, and there's not really anyone that is kind of sympathetic to her outside of her kind of her own sort of sister. Now it just seems that the slightest kind of like, really before you get into the kind of the more overt things that happen that are a negative effect, the slightest little bump in the road and the villagers are kind of like cursing her name when like only the scene before they were really kind of like praising her as a saviour of the village. It is a little bit slow. I do feel it's maybe a little bit overlong for its own good, particularly the ending. The ending to me seems very kind of elongated. I didn't think it needed to be quite as long. And I won't say what happens, but this is where the more overt sort of supernatural stuff happens, and I felt like it could be a little punchier. And I also don't think it was, despite the fact that I think it goes on for too long, I think that was a little convoluted as to what's actually happening and who's kind of responsible for what's happening within that kind of last 20-25 minutes. Again, I can't be any more precise than that, otherwise I'll kind of give away. But suffice to say that something that supernatural happens, and it's like, is this someone doing this, or is this a multiple things? It's just like, now, again, I feel it was too long than it needed to be, but also the storytelling aspect of that was probably the weakest element of the movie. But that's really the only kind of negatives I would say, to be honest. I mean, it's, as I say, it's not exactly action-packed. It doesn't really play like a traditional horror movie. It plays like a drama. So those of you who want more of an overt horror experience rather than a kind of dramatic period piece, maybe less enthralled with this one. But I've got to say, the movie is what it is, and I'll kind of judge it for that. But overall, this is a very well-made film. I was quite impressed. In actual fact, I'll give this one an 8 out of 10. It was pretty good in my estimation. Just a few niggles, just a couple of niggles here and there, but it was a strong, well-made production. I mean, it's well acted, it's well produced, the cinematography, the camera work, you know, it's all very good. Just a few maybe script issues, I would say, prevent this from, you know, from being a top draw entertainment. But it's still pretty strong. 8 out of 10 for me. Would you see it? Have you seen it? Please do let me know, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.